I'm starting. Hi, folks, with Tacitus today. Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. Please listen to this presentation as you would a radio broadcast. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the issue of black student education, black education, and particularly in the United States, but I suppose it could apply anywhere. Now, we need to go back to the 1950s here, but let me just set the scene. The claim by black activists is that black students, school students, or even college students for that matter, must have and must only have black teachers and lecturers. There must be people that look like them. That's the only way it's going to work. Because if they have white teachers, they're somehow made to feel inferior through some form of ideological osmosis, I guess. But they're made to feel inferior, which means they don't try as hard or can't relate to what's being taught. And the additional thing that all education should include an ideological element, which means that it can't be just straight mathematics or reading and writing or anything like that. You have to introduce, for black students, the whole subject has to be laced with evil white, colonialism and slavery and so on. So it's also meant to be an ideological victim confirmation type education, which black teachers will more readily apply and are more readily radicalized. Although I don't think there's any shortage of white teachers that would do that these days. Teachers training colleges are just hotbeds of ideological fanaticism. But anyway, let's go back to now. In the 1950s, the schools were segregated, or even earlier than that. The schools were segregated, and the activism which really started to come up in the 1950s, or particularly so in the 1950s, was that if black kids were black kids weren't performing as well as white kids. Okay, so they were falling well behind, as indeed they are still today. And the reason for this was cited, well, it's obviously racism. There can be no other explanation here. Is it that black kids goof off more, that they truant more, they're disruptive in class, or they can't be bothered, or they don't do their homework or assignment? Could it be that? No. It's those evil fucking fascist, fucking Nazi racists. They're the problem. But white people are the problem. So that was the activist position then. And the view was that segregated schools where there were only black teachers at the black schools, and the administration staff at the schools were black and so on. So it was a top to bottom black gig. And but no, this was no good. The black activists, the sort of the Martin Luther King type brigade, didn't want that. And the reason blacks are falling behind is because the black teachers aren't as good as the white teachers, was the claim, widely made at the time, and that the school facilities were better in the white schools than they were in the black schools, and that the areas that had the black schools typically had a lesser tax take. They were poorer areas generally, so they had a lower tax take, which meant that local governments couldn't afford to, or didn't have as many resources, I guess is more to the point, to put into the schooling. And this difference in resources and quality of teachers and facilities, that was why black kids weren't doing as well. So if the black kids were put in the white schools, then the yellow brick road paradise would be found, and the black kids would do just as well as the white kids, because then they would have the same higher quality teachers. They'd be in schools that had better facilities and better amenities and so on. Now, that, needless to say, didn't work, and failed, I would argue, horribly. So that was a disaster. Now, it could have been made to it. The idea of a sentiment or a good intention and then just ramming it down people's throats, and doesn't work. It probably would never going to work. As just as a concept, it's fine, but as a practical reality, it's different. Why were black schools separate? Well, it was viewed at the time, and there were plenty of people writing about it. Black kids were far more disruptive. They were more likely to steal anything that wasn't nailed down. and they were going to be, they'd be all sorts of thuggery and drugs and misbehavior and gangs and so on and so forth. So it's better to keep the black kids or the black students, in this case high school students, separate, and then everything would sort of be go along fine. Now, so the idea that this was wrong, that segregation was wrong, was again an ideological sort of concept. If the black kids had access to more amenities and better teachers, the white teachers. So no one disputed the white teachers were better, but anyway, so they moved the black kids into the schools. Now, if they'd had a sort of a, I don't know, a halfway school or something like that, they could have gradually worked this through and made it work to some extent. So there were better black students. There were black students that studied hard and hit the books. Maybe not very many, but that's not really the point here. So have a desegregated school. So parents had the option of sending their kids to a desegregated school, and the most promising black students could go to that school as well. And then everybody would be on board with it. But the white people didn't really like the idea of black kids being forced into the white schools, because whereas the blacks perceived that, the black activists perceived that the outcomes would be better for black kids, again, better schools, better amenities and so on, the white kids or the parents of the white kids saw that it would reduce the quality of education for their white children, because black students would be in class and they'd be disruptive and difficult. There'd be need for more security and so on. Part of the reason that schools in poor areas don't have as good amenities, and I've got experience at high school in a poor area and in quite a well-to-do area, is that the kids in the poor area would steal things that weren't nailed down, and so schools were constantly having to replace things, and basic kit. Students would be vandalizing whatever they could vandalize, they were disruptive in class and so on. Whereas, in a more affluent area, things that didn't get stolen. Parents would contribute and they had higher incomes in the affluent area. Parents would contribute wherever they could. So the school library, in the affluent area, where was probably 4 times as big as the school library in the poor area, as much as anything, because kids kept stealing books and the books couldn't be replaced, and parents were unwilling or didn't see the point in contributing books to the school library, whereas in the affluent area. So a lot of the facilities in the affluent area were because things weren't getting stolen and because parents were contributing more actively and were giving much more attention to it. So there were reasons, there were differences in facilities. It wasn't simply that one was a poor, one was a rich area. If you took the parents' equation out of it, then the difference in amenities probably wouldn't have been that great, if any at all, between the poor and the rich schools. I mean, so they inserted black students into the white schools on the basis that this will fix it, but it didn't. And in fact, nothing really changed for the black students. I suppose on a mathematical basis, some must have black students. I mean, some must have done okay out of it. I don't know. The number must have been, from what I can tell, was very small. If you look at the overall outcomes in 1950, the overall outcomes today, if anything, they've gone backwards slightly. So it's been a retrograde step to some extent. Now look at today, where the black activists, the same race grifters as were around back then. Back at the time, you could say, well, they sort of had some sort of a degree of moral legitimacy that they simply don't have today. The black activists, this is because they could point to, look, we're being treated as second-class citizens. There's the black entrance. This was more in the South. You wouldn't really see this in the North East so much. So they're only happening in parts of America where they tend to focus on that and say that was all of America, where it wasn't. That's not true. Now, at best in those days, black kids were getting maybe this was even after segregation had ended, school segregation. At best, these black kids were only getting a couple of years of high school, and then they were out, hanging out or working at a job. Say in the South, they maybe working on the family farm, those sorts of things. So anyway, but today the argument sort of goes in reverse. The black activists say, well, we don't want white teachers. We want black teachers. Those black kids must have black teachers. The reason these kids aren't doing any good, the black students, is because they haven't got black teachers. Well, whoa, hold on a minute. 50, 60, 70 years ago, the game was the opposite. They're not doing any good because they haven't got white teachers. Now you're saying they're not doing any good because they haven't got black teachers. Well, they had black teachers before and weren't there. So what's the goal here? What's happening? And so this is among the many race grifts that go on today. Now, why aren't black kids doing any good? Again, I've been not for very long, but I was in a high school briefly in a poor area, and why did kids not do any good? Well, the parents didn't give a stuff about education. That's a part of it, and the inclination to misbehaviour just seemed to be endemic to certain kids. And no matter how often they were punished, they always viewed it that they were just unlucky getting caught, not that they'd done anything wrong. And whereas in the affluent school, if someone got punished for something, they would stop that behaviour. If that behaviour gets me punished, I'll stop it. I won't do that behaviour again. Whereas in the poor area, as I say, the view was, I've just got to be better at not getting caught. That's it. That's the solution to here. The misbehaviour itself, what are you talking about misbehaviour? I mean, there was no concept of misbehaviour. So the idea of stopping the bad behaviour is something they just couldn't seem to relate to. Now, they're also, it's a much more migrant-intensive area, and the Arabic people in particular seemed incapable of stopping bad behaviour. And again, this was a school that had public canings where you had to stand up in front of the school and get your punishment. And these people didn't seem to, these kids just didn't seem to understand that. So there's a difference in behaviour. Now, the idea of keeping people with bad behaviours away from students with good behaviours is a very good idea. The bad behaviour students will disrupt the class, will disrupt the education. They'll make it much harder for the better performing students, the more diligent and conscientious and studious students. And so the idea of keeping them separate is there. Now, that used to be the case. Again, when I was a kid in high school, the dumb kids would be put in one class and the bright kids in another. And they had one school that had eight streams, 1 to 8 for the form, and there was, I don't know, 180, 190 kids in the form or something. So they had 25, 30. But I remember the bottom classes had, 40, 50 kids in them, whereas the top classes had 15 to 20 kids in them, that type of stuff. So the brighter students were getting much more attention, and the better teachers would be allocated to the better students. And so, the teachers that were teaching the dumbest kids had also done, say, a module in social work and things like that. And it probably wasn't a bad idea to allocate teachers in that way. There's a certain sort of practical, sensible thing about it. But coming back to the idea of mixed race schools, once you talk mixed race, you talk about mixed behaviour schools, and this is really the material point here. Bright kids, studious kids, conscientious kids, kids with a lot of parental support, surrounded by lots of books, that type of thing. They should be supported and encouraged. They're going to be hopefully the future CEOs, the people who start up businesses, the scientific researchers that find the cure for cancer and so on. They're the sort of, and you do want to encourage them. They're going to be a small group that they may be. They're going to advance society in a way that the others couldn't even contemplate in a million years. And keeping the bad behaviour kids together is, if you can't change that behaviour, and if any one of those kids shows promise, the bad behaviour kids shows intellectual promise, then yeah, sure, move them along. I mean, wow, get them out of there and encourage them, give them a scholarship, and I'm all for scholarships. So the way to improve black outcomes was to select the brightest kids, the ones who've got that ability to transcend the race class stuff, and then sure, encourage them, give them after school classes, give them scholarships and encouragement every way you can, and that's a good thing. But that's the only way it's going to work. It's not going to work by forced mixing of very different behaviours and very different attitudes to education. It just reduces the overall average and becomes a zero-sum game. You've been with Tacitus today. You'll push back, Sharon. Thank you for listening.